Welcome everybody to this fourth post-match analysis after the climate negotiations at every year at the COP and the other events that coincide with that. We have had this. This is a tradition now. This is the fourth one. We're very glad to have a very large number of participants. So hopefully you will find this very rewarding because we have a fantastic panel in helping us navigate what happened at COP29 and the way forward. So we will have a, a new slide, I think, with the presenters shortly. But I'll start presenting them anyway. Oh, that's me. That's not. Here we go. Yeah, I'm. Maybe I should say a few words about myself. I'm Björn-Ola Linnér. I'm a professor at Linköping University at the Center for Climate Science and Policy Research and Environmental Change, which was one of the hosts. I'm also affiliated to Stockholm Environment Institute, which is another host of this event, and also program director for Mistra Geopolitics, which is the third partner in organizing this. So now we turn to the panel. Sorry about that. Yeah, so we have Mattias Frumerie, who is Sweden's climate ambassador since last year. He has also been the head of the delegation to the negotiations since 2020. So we're very happy to have him here as well. Then we have Priyatma Singh. She is a researcher lecturer at the University of Fiji and also affiliated to Linköping University as a doctoral student. Priya was at the COP29, invited to speak about climate relocation and the challenges faced by the communities in Fiji. Then we have Erik Kjellström, who is a professor in climatology at the SMHI, the Swedish Met Office. We're very fortunate also to have Erik as a member of the advisory board for the Center for Climate Science and Policy Research. And if I remember correctly, was your first COP, right? At least as part of formerly part of the Swedish delegation. So are excited to hear about your experiences from COP. Then we have Katie or Katherine Browne. She's the team leader at Stockholm Environment Institute, where she leads the international climate risk and adaptation work. She's served as an expert in the 3-year technical expert dialogue process that led up to the financial goal. That was one of the highlights or one of the really was in the spotlight this year in COP29. So we are excited to have you as part of the panel as well. And then we have Mattias Goldmann is very well known at least in Sweden and beyond, because I remember that you got some award from France for all your work when it comes to climate. You're also the CEO of the Swedish 2030 Secretariat and author of a book that is a Christmas tip this year, right? Klimatsynda in Swedish, I think that would be roughly translated as the imperative to commit climate sins. Maybe you can explain that later on. And that is the panel. So without further ado, we will turn to the questions. First, a reminder, we will have a set of questions. First, two questions that will go to all the panelists and then dig into a little bit more in-depth into what happened at COP29. But we are also very keen to hear your questions. So please post them in the Q&A function which you would find here on Zoom. And then we will have a moderator, either it's Madeleine Ostwald or Nagmi Nasiri Tusi, who will help out to sort out the questions so we can post them to the panel, and one of them will post them to the panelists after we had a round of sort of the more the questions that I prepared. Okay, with that, I think we can turn to the first question to the panelists, which is the same question we asked every year. The two first comes every year. And the first one is, what will we remember from COP29 in 10 years' time? Could we start with you, Katie, who was then covering what was the highlight or the topical question this year?
Sure. I didn't know I was getting to go first, so I'll take the space. Sure. I think that we are most likely to remember this COP as one in a succession of COPs that unfortunately has undermined faith in the multilateral process on climate. I think many people who have been around many COPs were really feeling echoes of Copenhagen in 2009 with a sense of disappointment in the process. I mean, I think from the climate finance perspective, the outcome is pretty weak, although we can always compare it to the counterfactual of not having an outcome at all or not having a decision, which may have been worse. I think people debate that. And I think what maybe is most problematic about that is the sense that the process was perhaps not honestly brokered by the Azeri presidency, which I think undermines confidence. And then, of course, it was the third petrostate in a row to host, and I think that that is becoming problematic. Of course, I think if we only hosted COPs in, advanced liberal democracies, they would all be in Western Europe, and that wouldn't be a good outcome either. But I think we did see that it has, contributed to questions about the process. And then finally, I would say if you were there, you will remember the air pollution. But hopefully 2 years of air pollution in a row, and we'll get to go somewhere with clean air next year. Thank you. I'll hand over.
Yes, Mattias Frumerie, over to you.
Thanks, Björn-Ola. Great to be with you this morning. And as you say, indeed, a tradition now to do this post-match analysis. I think from my perspective, obviously, this COP is going to be remembered for the new climate finance goal, which, of course, would also celebrate its 10-year anniversary then in 2035, I mean, since the goal has that time frame. So definitely the climate finance goal.
Thank you, Priya. What will you remember in 10 years' time?
Thank you, Björn-Ola. I think in my view as a Pacific Islander and from the perspectives of the small developing islands, I think this COP29 has been deeply frustrating as you continue to struggle against developed economies. So I believe, in 10 years down the lane, it would be remembered as a COP of missed opportunities, as it couldn't really lock in any concrete plans to limit global temperature to 1.5. As island nations struggling with climate adaptation efforts, we really wanted to see some tangible outcomes for adaptation and loss and damage funds, which could have helped us to implement many of these spending targets and strategies, which would have really helped us to move forward. But I think for us, for the developing island nations, it has been quite a frustrating experience. So yeah, COP29 would be remembered as a lot of missed opportunities for us. Thanks.
Thank you. Erik?
Yeah, as you said, this was my first COP, so I have a lot of experience or a lot of interesting thoughts after it, of course. I can only echo what has been said here already to some extent. It's, I mean, the results are really disappointing. And again, I would have to say the words on how to really strongly get going with the reduction of emissions, etc. That is really lacking a lot here. So we are definitely not on our way to manage the 1.5 degree temperature target or anything like that. So that's a really big disappointment. The climate financing, of course, it's a good starting point there that something is happening, but there is of course also a large disappointment about the amounts there from the large parts of the world, and I guess that will be discussed a lot in the future. On a personal side also, as I said, this was my first COP, so that was very interesting in that sense. I will always remember the kind of bizarre feeling of going with the bus from the hotel in the morning to the conference facility, passing by the oil fields with the active pumps standing there and drilling up oil from the bedrock in Baku. That is something that will always be on my mind. But I will always and also remember really the very, very hard work that is being put down there by the delegations. And I think that both the Swedish delegation and the European delegation, they are working really, really hard to get in more ambitious writings about mitigation, etc. So I think we should not forget about that. Thanks.
Thank you, Erik. And Mattias Goldmann.
Thank you. I've got it won't, it might, and it will. The won't is where I disagree with my name sharing a friend, Mattias Frumerie, I don't think it will be remembered as a finance COP, because the promise of $300 billion is simply too little, too late, and not credible, because Trump and others are going to make sure that that money, unfortunately, won't be forthcoming. Also, there's not even a definition on how to count that money. So it won't be remembered as that. It might be remembered as the carbon finance in a wider sense, because at the very first day of this COP, we got the Article 6 finally in place on how to finance investments for reducing emissions in other countries, how to do the trading of carbon. Depending on how that goes, this might be the beginning of something either beautiful or another big to the climate. It will be remembered, I believe, as the beginning of the end of the road for huge mega climate meetings. 65,000 people registered, all these fossil flights, all these people going when you might just as well connect online. And when we realize that we do have the Paris Agreement, it's there, it stands, and we're now building more and more on the technical side. So I believe that the fight between Australia and Turkey on where to host the COP after the next one is going to be the start of saying, let's just meet and have technical sessions in Bonn instead, because another frustrating mega event like this is simply not what we need. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks, Mattias. Goldmann, you introduced several of the topics that we will return to. So that was excellent. And we got some debate going, hopefully, already. So thanks for that. Thank you all. Then for the second question to all panelists, which is perhaps my favorite one, it's your insider tip. What was the media reporting missing, or what has not been on the radar in the public discussion that are important outcomes from Baku? Should we take the same order? But we can start with Mattias Frumerie this time, because that was the order that I introduced you. So sorry for putting you on the spot, Katie. We start with Mattias.
Thanks. Well, maybe sort of not so much of an insider tip, but what I sense has not been maybe reported enough is I mean, as others my fellow panelists stated just now, I mean, the complete absence of progress when it comes to mitigation, apart from Article 6, which, I mean, as Mattias Goldmann mentioned, was of course a key outcome. But for the other mitigation aspects, I mean, we did get a decision on the mitigation work program, but it was basically no substance in there, more focused on the process. But it was quite clear, you know, that countries like Saudi Arabia and other fossil fuel producers did not want us to see any kind of follow-up from the global stocktake decision in Dubai last year. And we were, from the EU side, very keen to build that kind of platform for COP30 next year, when we will be assessing all the NDCs and to see to what extent that we as a global community jointly have implemented the GST outcomes. So I think that has been, I would have been happy to see further reporting on that, and the reasons for that kind of lack of progress being very apparent at COP29.
Thanks. Then Katie, please.
Sure. My insider tip would be that you're not really supposed to understand what the new climate finance goal actually is supposed to mean. I think that there's been a lot of confusion about what the numbers mean. So we have the $300 billion number and the 1.3 trillion number, and they both have different sources. And so the 300 billion is basically a tripling of the original goal, but it also now includes South-South finance. So in some ways it's a bit weaker. And also others have pointed out that with inflation, it's actually equivalent to 230 billion in 2035. And so it's really not a tripling. And then as for the 1.3 trillion, it could basically mean anything. You know, it counts all sources, all scaling, all finance. And this roadmap that they have laid out is supposed to be clarifying that. But I think that it's written in a way that's intended to be confusing, and it's supposed to give everyone a lot of wiggle room. And that is, I think, I mean, back to Priya's point, why many countries are so dissatisfied with the outcome. And I'll also say that the outcome, that the goal itself has been explicitly misstated by the Azeri presidency in publications after the COP saying that the 300 billion is from public sources only, which is not true. So if you're confused, that's what you're supposed to be. So don't feel bad about that.
So who do you think is behind the sort of the confusion? Is it a conspiracy, or was it?
It's not a conspiracy. It's a convenient ambiguity. You know, there's no real commitments, you know, no tangible commitments really beyond what's already been committed. And I think, again, the alternative is you don't have an agreement, and that's not a good outcome either. So I think that's why the goal is written the way it is.
Thanks, Katie. We will return to the financing in the follow-up discussions. Priya.
Thanks, Björn-Ola. And thanks, Katie, for that comment as well. I think it's supposed to be confusing, and that is very, very frustrating for us, for the small island developing nations that are really, you know, having difficulty even accessing some of these funds, which makes it even more confusing and more difficult for us to understand where this sources of funding is going to come from. But I think from my experience, particularly in regards to loss and damage, I was really hoping that, you know, it would really take off after COP27, COP28. But compared to last year, L&D didn't make much headlines. And so for me, of course, that was very disappointing. Of course, the establishment of the Loss and Damage Fund has been a recurring headline, and some countries, including Sweden, has made some important financial pledges. But other than that, I feel like it is being sidelined. The operational details of how the funds will be accessed by the vulnerable nations remain vague. And the fact that it is still not included in the climate finance goal is also very, very frustrating for us as well. It also lacks clarity in terms of the governance structure or the financing mechanisms or the disbursement criteria, which means that the small island developing states will continue to face difficulties in accessing these funds. And I think despite our tremendous repeated efforts to highlight the plight of vulnerable communities, the difficulties that the indigenous communities are facing while living their homes and the non-tangible losses associated with it, I feel the global coverage and the narrative around loss and damage continues to focus on the economic impact, and the non-economic impacts, such as the loss of cultural heritage or the native biodiversity, or even the mental health and well-being of these local and indigenous communities, are still pretty much under the radar. And I was hoping that loss and damage funding mechanisms would gain more traction, but unfortunately it did not. So yeah, for me, that is something that didn't really take off in this COP. Yeah.
Thank you, Priya. Mattias, Goldmann.
Thank you so much. Wise things have been said. First of all, what is not secret anymore is that now we see that the host country, in this case, Azerbaijan, openly uses the COP to sell more fossil fuels. So it's now a place to negotiate what is really detrimental to combating climate change. It's sad, but at least it's in the open so that we can discuss it clearly and see how we can potentially stop that. I also concur with Mattias that it's sad that it's now also in the open that these negotiations are less and less about mitigation, less and less about reducing emissions, which is what we ultimately need to do, and very fast. But the thing that I would emphasize is how the deal was made on Article 6 on the very first day of the COP, because that shows that we realize that these negotiations are just way too slow. They're not, in fact, moving in the right direction at all in some of the topics that we're discussing here. And that means that every host country from now on is struggling to find what is our claim to fame. How can we take one part of the negotiations and find sort of a special solution to at least get some positive outcome and some positive momentum and something to be positively remembered by. So the way that Article 6 was, sort of taken out of context, there was a sort of shady deal on how that finally It's the last part of the Paris Agreement that finally became agreed upon 9 years after the Paris Agreement itself. And I believe that many host countries will, after this, henceforth, look at COP29 and see how that was done. So at least it's something that's going to be put on the table, because clearly when everybody has to agree, we see that we're not getting any results, nowhere near where we need to be. Thanks.
Thank you, Mattias. And Erik.
Yeah, I will touch upon something slightly different, but from my perspective, and as I was following the research and systematic observations part of this meeting, there was a lot of talk about observations and early warning systems, and this is very much related to the loss and damage part that Priya was mentioning. Roughly half of the countries in the world don't even have a warning system for natural disasters like weather events, etc. So there's a very strong inequality here between the kind of global north and the global south, but also in terms of indigenous people especially. So I think that's a very important part here, and that also calls for. I mean, it is strongly linked also to all of these the financial discussions here, and at the end, this means that the adaptation part of all of this is it's a bit slow, and it's of course also strengthening the inequalities between the global north and the global south. And I think that's a very big problem here, as that also, of course, spills over to the mitigation part, as what happens here and now with weather and disasters in my area, so to speak. That's probably much more important than for most people than thinking about the kind of long-term mitigation goals. So I think there is a strong link here between these different parts. So I think that's an interesting part. And also in this very room I was sitting in and discussing these things, there is a strong opposition from many countries in even mentioning impacts of climate change and extreme weather events, etc. And that is not only the fossil fuel producing countries, but also other big countries that are really highly dependent on that technique. While then many of the small ocean states, etc., they are strongly advocating for why that should be better included in this text. So I think there is, of course, also a very strong kind of, what should I say, line between the different rooms. So of course, the different countries and parties, they are negotiating in all of the rooms. And that was very apparent to me from that perspective. Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Erik. And you can leave your mic on, because the first question will go to you. And I was kind of pondering if questions should go first or last, but I think it might be an important starting point from what we will be discussing henceforth. I remember last year at the closing of COP28, the UN climate chief, Summer Steele, said, "This is not the finish line, but a lifeline for 1.5 degrees." So my question to you is, has the lifeline to achieving 1.5 degrees now finally burst?
I think that in my view, and in most climate researchers I talk to, I think there has kind of never been a 1.5 possibility, not even actually when the Paris Agreement was written. So in a way, I mean, we have always this kind of message. We are advocating, we are saying that, of course, it's good. We should really try to strive to keep things, to limit ourselves to 1.5. But if you look at the actual numbers and how they have also been revised over the year, there is a new paper from this summer when they are looking into it again and trying to add up numbers. And at that point, they added up numbers until the early start of 2024, claiming that there is only a 50% chance or so of staying below 1.5. Then we have like 4 years of emissions still to be there. And the emissions are still not decreasing. They are still increasing or possibly leveling out at the best. So there is very little chance that we will end up managing 1.5. There will be some kind of overshoot, and then potentially you could get back in the long run. And one of the parts in why these numbers have been actually reduced compared to when AR6, the IPCC report, was written, it's of course partly because we have emitted more in these few years. That's quite obvious. But there have also been revisions in terms of how you connect the emissions of greenhouse gases, especially with CO2, but also with aerosols. And when we are reducing CO2 emissions, if we manage to do that, we will also reduce much of the emissions of particles. And these particles have mainly reflecting and cooling impact on the climate. And as soon as we are reducing the emissions, and these particles, they will kind of disappear immediately, and then you will have much of this warming that is already inherent in the system. It will kind of show up, and that's partly what is happening now and has been happening over the last decade or so, or even longer in Europe and North America, where this process started earlier. So I think it's very unlikely that we will, or I don't see how 1.5 degree could be achieved in the short run. We have problems, I guess, still managing to stay below 2 degrees. So that would be more of the message in that sense, unfortunately.
Mattias, Goldmann, you're usually more optimistic in what happens in the transformation. What do you say? Is there a lifeline for 1.5, or maybe in the analogy that Erik had, can we even find a lifeline?
No, 1.5 with COP29 well and truly died. It is very sad, but it's also very important to realize that there's no need to go from denial to despair, because 1.7 is a lot better than 2, and 2 is a lot better than 2.3, and so forth. So every emission reduction counts. And of course, next year's COP 2030, COP 30 is all about the new NDCs, and that we have to do enhanced action. Every party of the convention has to show how we reduce the emissions. And that is urgently needed just to keep 2 degrees alive. So there's no point in faking it and pretending that 1.5 is alive, because even backtracking, when this year is probably going to be the first year above 1.5, and there's no way that we can, even with technology, find a way back. I unfortunately believe, but as you say, Björn-Ola, the optimist way now is to see that every emissions reductions count and to not give up, because I hear a lot of people saying, well, we're going to miss those targets. There's no point anymore. There is, and every emissions and the sense of urgency matters.
Thank you, Mattias. If I may, Mattias, Frumerie, may I ask a follow-up from that? What would it entail? What is the repercussions for the negotiations if we finally conclude that one of the important goals of the Paris Agreement cannot be reached?
Well, first of all, I mean, I would argue that 1.5 didn't die with COP29. It is definitely something which that's our target. I mean, that's the limit we set ourselves in the Paris Agreement, and that's what we'll be retaining to. I mean, of course, we're hearing, as Erik just was saying, that the window, is rapidly closing, and that's what we've been saying for the past couple of years. We need to see stronger action from not least the G20 countries. And we now have the opportunity to actually see that action being taken through the new nationally determined contributions, which all countries are supposed to be handing in during the course of next year. And that is why we would have hoped to have seen, to set that kind of platform at COP29, to already sort of prepare for how we can make that kind of assessment at COP30, to see also not only sort of how far we've come with the new NDCs, but also, what kind of action would we need to be taking further in case we come to a situation at COP30 where we see that we're still not hitting the target of 1.5, but rather sort of that there is the kind of emission reductions that countries are putting forward are not sufficient. But I mean, from our perspective, what we together with our EU partners and others will be doing now for the coming year is obviously to be working very hard together with countries globally, and not least the G20, to ensure that we do deliver jointly all the NDCs, which to the extent possible will ensure that we do deliver on 1.5. So I think for us, that's there's no question on where the focus needs to be, and I would hope that our global partners are also seeing that kind of opportunity with the new NDCs to present the kind of solutions which already are available.
Thank you, Mattias. Yeah, so those hopes or those lifelines might be extremely important coming the next year. Sweden's Minister for Climate and the Environment, Romina Pourmokhtari, concluded that the president-elect Donald Trump had cast his shadow over the COP, despite not being formally the president yet. We also saw that the Argentinian delegation withdraw, and we have heard Javier Milei, the president, talking before that he intended to draw with Argentina from the Paris Agreement. Now he says that they will not, but there is still doubt about that. And some expect to see a domino effect of more populist climate skeptic leaders following the Trump's administration's anticipated withdrawal from the Paris Agreement. So will we see such a domino effect? Is that a tangible threat to the negotiations, Mattias, Frumerie?
I don't see that coming in particular. I mean, we had those kind of fears or speculations the last time round when the then Trump administration left the Paris Agreement. There was no mass exodus, so I don't see that happening now either. But I think what's a point to make here is, of course, that and this sort of links to the lack of progress when it comes to mitigation also at COP29, is that the transition, it is happening and it is picking up speed in countries globally, not least when it comes to a country like China, who, yes, they are at the one hand sort of the world's largest user of coal power, but they're also the world's largest user of solar and wind. So transitioning is taking place in the world's largest emitter, and I would think that as more and more countries embrace the transition and see the possibilities that the transition entails and what it brings in terms of new jobs and growth and strength and competitiveness, we will see that it's the acceleration happening even quicker. And of course, a key element for countries globally is to ensure that there is a just transition, that everyone is on board on the transition, and that whatever kind of costs that come as a result of the transition are borne in a way which caters to everyone's needs in the transition. And I think here again, so many countries, including a country like Sweden, has examples in terms of how we have managed structural reforms throughout our history. Of course, the challenge here with the transition to net zero is that it needs to happen quicker, and it needs to happen across the economy at the same time, which of course makes it a bigger issue to deal with. But the structures are there, at least for a country like Sweden, and that's again something which we hope to be sharing with partners, regardless if it's the US or China or anyone else. How do you manage your transition in a way which creates the kind of opportunities for everyone, and also caters to those, both societies and ultimately individuals, who maybe are struggling to find a place in the new economy. And sort of creating those kind of structures in your society, it will be equally important, which, than just your specific climate policies, because of course these policies, are impacting on the population or can be impacting on the population at large, and therefore you also need to have those more sort of social structures in place in order to manage the transition in a way which caters to everyone's needs.
So the fact that we see an ongoing transformation or transition that would take off pressure that to leave the Paris Agreement, is that sort of the if you look at the consequences for the Paris Agreement?
I think my short answer to that would be yes.
Yeah. Okay. Mattias, Goldmann, so you raised your hands, I think. And I would also like to add to this question. We also see that in Europe, we have countries like Germany and France, where you have your knighthood, that there is political turbulence that might also impede on sort of the willingness to underpin the Paris commitment, right?
Yes, I'm very worried about, as we already discussed, the 1.5 or 2 degree target, because we need urgent mitigation efforts now, and I don't see that happening nearly enough. But I'm not worried about many countries leaving the Paris Agreement as such, because it makes good business to be part of it. In fact, I'm willing to right now bet that even the US is not going to leave. I think there's a lot of things happening in the US right now that are very interesting, where Republican states say that renewable energy makes sense. A lot of what the Biden administration put forward in terms of the IRA for renewable and sustainable energy is going to be kept because most of the money went to Republican states. So and we survived Trump once. And he tried to enhance the coal industry. He couldn't, because fossil fuels simply don't make business sense in a market economy anymore. So I'm not as worried for the Paris Agreement as I am for the world, because the Paris Agreement, for good and for bad, it's not so strong that you need to leave it, but it's not so strong that we can feel that it gives us hope in itself for the future.
And I know that you had a bet just a week or two ago about the train times in Sweden, right? How did that go? Did you become rich or poor?
You know what? I became rich at first because all the trains where I betted on were on time. But right now I'm sitting in a coffee shop because this train was delayed. So then I lost all the money that I won in the first account. But of course, most people will still bet that the US is going to leave the Paris Agreement. So I expect to get more than double my betting if I win that the US is not going to leave. But clearly, it's not as clear cut that it seems that they will leave, because it simply makes too much good business. And remember that he's unpredictable. Not only Trump, but also his main climate advisor, Mr. Musk. But I believe that Mr. Musk will tell him it makes better business sense to stay in the agreement. But on the other hand, if he does leave, the Paris Agreement, it's a little bit like a party. If there's one very grumpy person who's just there to ruin the party for the rest of us, they might as well just leave.
Yeah, I would personally agree with that. I think I take you up on that bet, because then at least I have something to look for. Yes, a lunch. Thank you. Priya, it was a quite meager attention to loss and damage. You addressed it in your opening remarks here. But compared to last year, when it was sort of some saw it as a highlight of COP28, and quite a lot of optimism. And a few countries, including Sweden, pledged some new funding, but in the end, not included in the new climate target. And with the little attention we see, could we conclude that loss and damage is a resolved item? You implied otherwise in your introduction here, but if not, what will be required to get loss and damage to be truly effective and helping out a country like Fiji?
Thanks, Björn-Ola. Yeah, loss and damage is I mean, just gaining attention from COP27 and then last year as well. But like you said, it really didn't get that kind of attention this year. And we're really hoping that, there would be like a governance structure, a mechanism in place, a disbursement criteria that would enable us to access these loss and damage funds. But it's simply not getting that sufficient attention. And that, as I mentioned earlier, is very disappointing, because for us personally, for myself as a researcher who is working in space and who's working with a lot of communities at the ground level who are earmarked for relocation, I can actually see that, the economic losses are there, of course, but the problems caused by the slow onset problems, the sea level rise, coastal inundation, and the way these communities are now sort of deciding whether to relocate or not, because there's something called place attachment, and that is something which is really difficult to navigate. So it was really, for Fiji to tackle adaptation issues, climate-induced relocation is sort of a very last option for adaptation. And those communities that have already relocated, for instance, they're sharing their positive as well as negative experiences. And so these kind of experiences are now affecting the other communities as well, who are now skeptical about relocating. So when it comes to non-tangible losses, and when it comes to accessing funding, specifically for these type of non-tangible losses, I think for Fiji, it would I mean, we really need to push forward next year as well with this dialogue and bring back loss and damage into focus. We simply don't have the finances to support many of these strategies that are outlined in our national adaptation plans or in our relocation guidelines. So we're hoping that there would be a clear system in place, a clear governance mechanism for loss and damage next year. There's more discussion on it. So it's far from resolved as a negotiation item. The limited attention that LND is sort of getting this year and the decision to sort of exclude it from this new climate finance goal continues to highlight these ongoing challenges, rather than a conclusion to an issue. So for Fiji and for any other vulnerable island nation that is currently struggling with this adaptation, our focus is sort of from mitigation, changing to adaptation, because now we are having a lot of communities being earmarked for relocation. So for LND mechanism to be truly helpful, we would really need to sort of have a clear, transparent and accountable mechanism for accessing these funds. And that would mean really, straightforward application processes to access these funds without all these different bureaucratic delays. And of course, mechanisms to also track and report on the impacts of LND funds that would help to sort of build more trust in the system. Yeah, that's my take on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Priya. It's very insightful. Katie, from your perspective, then, is it possible to create this transparency in the funding of L&D and then how the fund will be used and the issues that Priya brought up?
I think it's possible, but unlikely. I think in general that in climate finance, we are seeing a lack of transparency and accountability, and that it's very deliberately that way. So in the beginning, someone highlighted that we don't have an agreed definition of climate finance. So this in and of itself makes it very difficult to track finance and see where it's going from and to and what it's doing. So I think loss and damage falls underneath that. And so it is absolutely possible. There are definitely ways to do it. There are, you could agree to accounting methodologies and clear definitions, and you could do these things. It's that the countries that give money don't want to do them. And I'll also just say, like, I agree that it's not necessarily resolved as a negotiation item on paper, but I think it is becoming very marginalized in the process. I think actually that the more important questions around loss and damage are happening in different forums now. So the Vanuatu has brought a case before the International Court of Justice on the legal obligations of states under climate change. And I think that venue right now is more significant for the loss and damage outcome, and any liability or responsibilities associated would be determined there and not under the UNFCCC.
Yeah, very interesting. Yes. So, which speaks to sort of the purpose and how the COP functions in the future, which we will return to in a short while. But first, I would like to go to if loss and damage was sort of the portal opening item that was really created a lot of buzz around the COP28 last year. This year, the host tried to do a similar thing with Article 6, that is the rules for global trading on emissions, mimicking the sort of the success of loss and damage last year. There's a lot to discuss there, and there's a lot of technicalities, but I think one of the core points is if this agreement now with having the Article 6 in the rule book in place will ensure the environmental integrity of with these adopted decisions. Mattias, Frumerie, do you feel confident that we are on the right track in how the emissions trading will be monitored and governed?
No, I mean, yes. I mean, otherwise we wouldn't have agreed to it. So, I mean, I think obviously there are things which always can be better, but I mean, this was the deal we got, and I think it was a deal which was good enough. And we're now looking forward to see how the rules will be actually implemented, and maybe more importantly, to what extent that countries will actually be using these kind of mechanisms. I mean, we from the Swedish side, as you know, we've been pretty far ahead in terms of in relation to other countries where I think it's us, you know, Switzerland, Norway, Singapore, maybe a couple of others who are well ahead in their planning in terms of how we intend to use Article 6, in our case, Article 6.2 to start with at least. And then we'll see to what extent that countries will also be using the mechanisms in 6.4. So, you know, yes, I mean, I think these the rules are now in place. We signed the agreements also with Nepal and Zambia as an example in terms of how we're progressing in using Article 6, and I think it's sort of up to the parties to see to what extent they will actually want to be using this. And I think an interesting development here as well, that hopefully the rules which we've now set will also help set a bit of a benchmark in relation to the voluntary carbon markets, which of course have been evolving, you know, in parallel in a way. But you know, for example, at the Africa Climate Summit last year, we saw quite a significant interest from many African countries to engage in various types of carbon trading systems, maybe more so on the voluntary side. So I think that's going to be an interesting space to watch. But of course, from a Swedish government perspective, we're going to be keen to ensure that whatever kind of rules that develop are as, you know, bring that kind of added value to the mechanism, that it actually helps increase mitigation efforts the way that we see that it was intended to.
Thanks. You mentioned 6.4. Could you briefly, for those who listen that are not so familiar with Article 6, explain the difference between 6.2 that Sweden is using and 6.4, which is sort of really the new thing, right?
Well, I mean, in very briefly, 6.2 is a basis for what we would call bilateral agreements. So, you know, agreements between countries. So in our case, it's the Swedish Energy Agency, which have been instructed by the government to do these agreements. So presently, I think we've done 6 or 7 of those, whereas Article 6.4 is then a UN-based mechanism where you would not sort of enter into bilateral agreements, but rather use the mechanism set up through the UN. So it's basically sort of a choice that countries can make. And, you know, I guess you could be using both of them as well. You know, ultimately, it might be just a matter of resources, how much you can engage in the kind of systems. But sort of the difference is that the one is bilateral agreements between 2 countries, and the other is in the framework of the UN system itself.
Thanks. A follow-up on that, Mattias Goldmann. So some politicians are quite optimistic what Article 6 can achieve. How do you think now, when we have a new part of the mechanism in place, 6.4, how should countries like Sweden make use of this Article 6 in your view?
I think there's a discussion right now whether the developed countries like Sweden are going to pick the low-hanging fruit and then leave the more expensive stuff for the developing countries to deal with, or whether we are going to do things that will help developing countries move further into mitigation and adaptation stuff. And by and large, I think that Sweden and other developed countries can help a cost being reduced, because this whole idea that there's a low-hanging fruit and then it becomes more expensive is typically not the case. Typically, the first solar panels, so the first electric cars and so forth, are much more expensive than what comes later on. So if we do this right, the Article 6.2 and Article 6.4 will help take the sort of higher cost in the initial phases of the transformation to a low carbon society. And so the proof is really on us developed countries to use the Article 6 in that sense. My own background is from CDM, the previous mechanism, that we all know that to some part managed to develop renewable energy in a sustainable way in developing countries, but also to a large degree didn't really give us anything that was additional and that was non-leakage. It gave us emissions reductions that would have happened anyway, and it also gave us emissions reductions that we paid for, and then less happened just around the corner. Even emissions increases happened around the corner. So we need the system to be much more robust than the CDM system, and clearly we don't know yet whether it's going to be there, because it's the follow-up mechanisms that have obviously not been put in place yet, because we just got the agreement the other week. So a lot of it is still out there, and watchdog work is clearly needed. But most of all, make sure that we're not picking low-hanging fruit, but reducing the cost for everyone.
Thanks. Let's turn then to an item that sort of was permitted a lot of the discussions, particularly in finance, but not only. And I would call it the mother of all COP conflicts. That is the quarrel between developed and developing countries, which we've seen through the decades that I covered these negotiations. This dichotomy cast its shadow over the new collective quantified goal on climate finance, but also other issues. So is this developed dichotomy obsolete? Some parties argue that it is, and others want to maintain it for reasons of their country status in the UN system. So the question is, a long introduction to the question, which I will pose to Katie first, I think. Is it time to scrap this concept altogether, this dichotomy between developed and developing countries, or is it even possible, since it's part of the sort of the 1992 framework convention? But several have suggested that it's now time to scrap it, both in international organizations and among scholars in academia. And number two then is it possible to revise this status within the UN system at all? Or does it still serve a purpose in the UNFCCC process? It's a long question.
Yeah, that was a long question, but I feel prepared. Yeah, so really quickly, just to say, for those who aren't familiar with the annexes, there are 23 developed countries and the EU, which are known as Annex 2 countries. And then the remaining countries are known as developing countries. This is the language of the UNFCCC. And those are Annex 1 countries. And yes, this was written into the framework in 1992. And so I think it's fair to say that it's obsolete. Like the world has changed a great deal since 1992. And I think that this dichotomy, which is quite distinct, and has different obligations placed on different parties, does not reflect the political and economic reality that we see right now. So just to give one example, during the COP Carbon Brief released an analysis that showed that China's historical emissions have surpassed the EU's. So at a very basic level, it's fair to say that this dichotomy does not reflect, in this case, historical responsibility for climate change. Though it's also important to say that per capita emissions in China are still much lower than the EU and other places like the US. I think that in terms of, I do think that it undermines the credibility of the agreement, or at least its functioning, in some areas more than others. So it's a major problem in climate finance. I would say it was maybe the biggest problem in the negotiations on the new climate finance goal, maybe even a bigger problem than the number. And ultimately was kind of a trade-off between the two things. In other areas, I think like transparency, it's actually less of a problem because the Paris Agreement sort of waters down the obligations of states. So all states, for example, submit biennial transparency reports. And so we see that the different obligations placed on states are less distinct as we're evolving. But I think that, it's very clear that many states do not want to break this dichotomy down. So, I mean, the clearest examples would be states who would be obligated to provide climate finance, like China and potentially the Gulf states. But I also think that realistically, nobody wants to reopen the annexes of the agreement right now. Like, I think that would be a Pandora's box. Like, can you imagine if we took away that dichotomy, the debates between all different countries about how to classify countries and by what metrics? And I think everybody right now is thinking the agreement is flawed. We recognize that it's not a perfect reflection of the world, but we can understand and work with those flaws, as opposed to if we tried to reopen it, it would be chaos and it would potentially undermine the ability of the agreement to function at all right now. But I do think that longer term, it's going to have to be addressed if the agreement's going to work, going forward. But for now, I think they're kicking the can down the road and saying, we'll deal with that in 5 or 10 years. That's my sense.
Thanks, Katie. Mattias, Frumerie, what do you think? Is it opening Pandora's box, and should the Pandora's box be opened in 5 years?
Well, I mean, I think in a way it was already opened at this COP. I mean, as Katie was saying, I mean, there is even in the text itself on the new goal, there is very clearly a line which says that any kind of obligations or any kind of contributions to the new goal does not impact on states or on parties being developed or developing. So in the sense it was addressed already here, and I don't think it's actually necessary to do any kind of renegotiation, because obviously it's up to parties themselves to determine what they are. Are they developed or developing? So if countries which we would perceive as being developed at this stage, China, the Gulf states, South Korea and others, it's just for them to say we're a developed country. That's it. You don't have to actually renegotiate the Paris Agreement or anything to actually change that. Who's in which group. And I think it's also sort of it really COP29 shone a light in that sense on the diversity of developing countries. I mean that it's a very diverse group. Countries from the small island developing states, the fragile countries which are very have numbers of different challenges, whereas then you have countries like India and China and Russia. But India and China, who would be perceived as being developing countries. So it's I mean, I think it's something which it's reality. It's how the agreement was reached, and I think there will still be a time where we will need to see the continued leadership from developed countries, as they're called, in terms of both emission reductions and in terms of finance. But the reality, I would say, is that all countries need to step up their game, regardless if it is on finance or mitigation or adaptation. And that's, I think, in a way, the beauty of the Paris Agreement, that it's designed in a way which enables all countries to step up their game in the pace that they see possible. And of course, from our side, and I think from the Swedish and EU perspective, our expectations when it comes to what countries should be stepping up their game first are, of course, higher when it comes to the G20, who account for 80% of global emissions. So if we are to, coming back to the 1.5 conversation, if we are to limit temperature rise to 1.5, it is the G20 which need to step up their game quite significantly. And I think we, from the EU side, we've been seeing how our share of global emissions is shrinking. On the one hand, because we're reducing our emissions, but also, of course, because other parts of the world are growing. So the focus, again, coming back to my point on what was underreported, what is being underreported, what we need to focus more on is, of course, the mitigation efforts of the G20 as a group, and what those countries need to do for us as a global community to join to live up to the kind of commitments we set ourselves in the Paris Agreement.
Thanks, Mattias. Katie, so you explained really well in the beginning of the sort of the basics in the Baku to BLM roadmap on how to master the climate finance. One thing that I didn't see any public discussion on, but as a researcher, I noticed that debt relief, which was only mentioned once in the agreement from last year, was mentioned 3 times this year. I don't know if it has any significance at all, but debt relief have really the last couple of years been on the radar when it comes to climate finance, to make sure that countries are not giving finance and then that goes to paying up, that the effect is eaten up by all the interest and debt that they are into. Do we see an increase in the actual work with the finance? Do we see an increased attention to debt question, or is that, like in the public debate, not so much on the radar anymore?
No, I do think there's meaning to the tripling of the word count of debt, to pay credence to your researcher approach. Yeah, I think that there is growing recognition of the debt crisis and the unsustainability of it, and the potential for especially like highly climate vulnerable and low income countries to go into debt spirals. And I mean, I think in the past decade alone, we've seen the number of low income countries in debt distress double from 30 to 60%. So you have 60% of the world's poorest countries are in this, they cannot pay their debts. And in fact, they're paying more towards their debts than they're paying towards healthcare and education combined. And so that's obviously not a good recipe for building climate resilience or investing in mitigation either. And so having participated in the sort of technical process that led up to the NCQG, the climate finance decision, debt was being discussed a lot. I mean, obviously it was being raised more by the countries who are are in debt than the countries that are holders of that debt. But I think there is recognition that it has to be part of the recipe. though I think the actual actors who can do something about that are in other forums. So we would think particularly of the G20, which those countries are often the ones that are holding the debt, and especially China. China now issues a lot of bilateral loans and has shown less willingness to participate in debt restructuring and debt forgiveness. And then, of course, the IMF and World Bank. So it's definitely part of the conversation, and the climate finance decision was trying to signal to those actors that climate finance should not be, delivered as non-concessional loans. But of course, there's many other sort of market dynamics at work there.
Thank you. Priya, what is yours?
Yeah, as a country coming from a country which is having debt burdens, so I think it's a relief that it got mentioned quite a lot this time around. But I think it needs to be translated into some actionable commitments. There are a lot of, like Katie mentioned, there are other forums as well where debt forums are, debt relief issues are being discussed. But I think there is still a lack of commitments or the mobilization of these mechanisms is still sort of like problematic for countries like Fiji, which are trying to find ways around this debt relief issues. So with the mentioning of debt relief mechanisms, I think it's sort of like a positive sign for now, but I hope, unlike loss and damage, it doesn't get diluted in the next COP, and that it does pick up pace as well, because we really need finance in the grants form, and we really need to be discussing finance that helps us to sort of commit to the actions and the strategies that are in our NDCs and NAP, and having this debt burden on top of this is really making our actions sort of like very difficult to achieve. So yeah, I think it would be promising if it picks up pace.
Thank you, Pia. So one thing that created quite a lot of discussion was 5 days into the conference, a press release from the Club of Rome made quite a splash in global media with the headline that it's clear that it is now clear that the COP is no longer fit for purpose. We need a shift from negotiation to implementation. That was Christina Figueiredo who led the negotiations previously, was one of the signers, Johan Rockström, and quite a lot of well-known people. Christina Figueiredo later corrected or needed to clarify that was actually not a phrase that was used in the letter, but it was definitely used in the media communication. So are they correct? I guess I know the answer to this from Mattias Frumerie, but I will ask you anyway. Is the COPs no longer fit for purpose?
I think it's fair to say that any kind of process, your process at the university or, any kind of company organization, it serves you well to every now and then reflect on how are you delivering on the kind of results that you set up to deliver. So that goes for the UNFCCC as well. And I think, it's in that sense, it's welcome to have that kind of input. Just as an example, when Sweden was chairing the EU last year, we actually hosted a seminar in the margins of one of the annual climate ministerial meetings, where we actually, we put forward this particular question: how can we make the process even more efficient? How can we streamline it to actually reflect? As you were saying, the fact that we now are more focused, or we should be more focused on implementation rather than sort of negotiating global frameworks for setting the direction. We have the direction clear. It is the Paris Agreement. So the question we should be asking ourselves is, of course, how do we make sure to use the process that we have to deliver the kind of results on the ground? And maybe not so much on the global level, but actually on the ground. And just to give you a hint of how, how that conversation went, when we discussed various types of reforms of the UNFCCC, one participant in this seminar just noted that any kind of decision on reforms will need to be taken by consensus. So, I mean, the prospects maybe for reforming the process itself might not be very, very promising, you know, in that light. But I think for us, you know, of course, any COP meeting, we would come out of it and sort of reflect on how have we been able to deliver on what we on the kind of priorities that we set ourselves. And, you know, again, having this COP meeting, which delivered nothing basically on mitigation, of course, that's a question we ask ourselves. You know, how can we ensure to deliver results on mitigation globally when there is such an urgency? And we also know that there are solutions available. So maybe we should be looking to, you know, what kind of other platforms do we have in order to deliver those kind of results, you know, as a complement to the negotiation process. I mean, the UNFCCC, I would think, at least, will always be sort of the key element in the global climate diplomacy framework. But we have something we call the Leadership Group for Industry Transition, which we run together with India. It's a great platform to make progress on mitigation, specifically in the hard-to-abate sectors. We have, you know, our engagement in the Coalition of Finance Ministers for Climate Action, where we lead the track on carbon pricing together with Ecuador, where we might, you know, get much more traction on carbon pricing issues than we would get in the negotiations themselves. And of course, we have all the various types of efforts that we do bilaterally with countries in terms of highlighting the kind of solutions which we see are available. So I would think, you know, many of us will probably be reflecting on how we can achieve the kind of results we want to achieve, you know, in complementarity to the UNFCCC process, but of course, at the same time, also looking to how we can actually change the process itself. But, you know, we'll be working, I think, on multiple tracks in that sense.
Thank you, Mattias. We have only 4 minutes until I want to turn the word over to the questions from the audience. But I'm quite keen to get at least a short reflection from all the panelists on this critical issue on if the COPs are fit for purpose and how it can be that, and that entails a lot of questions. I saw that Mattias Goldmann wanted in here as well, and then I will ask Erik the same question, being a first-time COPper, and then Priya and Katie as well.
First of all, obviously, Mattias Frumerie is right that formally the reform might not be forthcoming, but there's a lot of things that could still be done. First of all, remember when Fiji was hosting the COP and said, you know what, it's going to be in Bonn because we're still going to be the host, but we're going to hold it in Bonn because it makes so much better sense. And that also made it a smaller COP. Secondly, there was 45,000 people in Paris when we got the Paris Agreement. There was 65,000 people in Baku, Azerbaijan, and nobody could argue that COP29 was anywhere near as important as COP21 in Paris. So they've simply been exploding and are now very bloated. So I think we should also, all of ourselves as civil societies and organizations, also think, should we really be that many at this kind of meetings? And then thirdly, what Mattias Frumerie also pointed out, let's have more technical discussions. When the Paris Agreement was agreed upon, it was also agreed upon that now we have the framework, and henceforth it's largely technical. So it could be much smaller and much more efficient.
Thanks. Erik?
I think that was very wise words. It's very, very big, and it's very, very complicated in that sense. And the outcome of the COP, both this time and before, is, I mean, it's way too weak. So it's very dispersed over many different subjects. And I think that is something that needs to be dealt with. But I'm still thinking that, of course, the process as such, it's very much needed. And we need to have this global framework where all of the parties really meet and can discuss these issues and bring the whole thing forward. This is, of course, not the only thing that will save the world, for sure. That's not where the innovation is made. But setting up the frameworks for that and having that possibility, I think that's really crucial. So, yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Erik. And we heard Fiji's hosting as one positive example, Priya. Should there be stricter criteria for host countries? That was one of the sort of proposals from this Club of Rome letter brought up by the Azerbaijani leadership, of course.
The suggestion to reform COP presidency selection process is well, that's a significant one. But while I don't have that many years of COP experience, I can say that such a reform is highly contingent on a lot of factors. So the tussle, for instance, between Pacific COP and Turkey for COP31 presidency, that is a clear example of such kind of geopolitics that comes into play when making a selection for COP presidency. So I think an immediate overhaul is very unlikely because this process is so consensus driven. But then, I think we really need to think about the negotiation team that represents the countries in these forums. Like, I think overall from the Pacific, there were 300 delegates that participated in this forum, and PNG withdrew their delegates just days before COP29. So I think we can take a very lean group of people to these negotiations and have sort of more technical discussions that is more centered around how we can, really utilize these finances for implementation purposes. So I think the discussion needs, and this discussions and dialogues need to really shift towards how to implement some of these commitments at the ground level. Because as a researcher, I'm really struggling with some of these decisions, these very high level decisions, and how that filters towards the national level and then towards the local and ground level. So I think there has to be a really more focused discussion that really looks into on the ground implementation of these strategies. So I think we can do with a smaller group and more technical oriented discussion, which is also region oriented, also looks at the climate vulnerable communities as well. I enjoyed the side events, by the way. I think they were really interesting. There was a lot of networking and a lot of discussion going on during this side event. So that was a good experience for me overall.
Thanks, Priya. And Katie, finally, a short one before we turn to the general questions.
Sure. I agree with much of what's been said and don't have much to add. What I would say is that I think there's also a perception problem with the COP, like a public perception problem, where we think that every year we need to reach some major agreement. But like Mattias Frumerie said, we have the agreement. We reached it in 2015. And that the functioning of the COP is evolving into something that's more around transparency and reporting and peer pressure, and having this moment where we all look at progress and assess progress collectively. And so I think also that we need to keep in mind that the functioning of the meeting has changed a lot, and that maybe the public perception of that has not kept up.
Thanks, Katie. Short and sweet. And now we will turn over to the questions from the audience, and then I'll leave the word over to one of our fantastic researchers at the Center for Climate Science Research, and also at the UI, the Swedish Institute for well, I don't remember the English title. Nagme, you can say it. Okay. Nagme, over to you.
Yes, the Swedish Institute of International Affairs.
Thank you.
So thank you so much for this great discussion, which sparked many questions from the audience. I will start by posing 3 questions, and then if there's more time, until the end, we'll pick up some more questions from the chat. So first of all, to Mattias Frumerie, how is Sweden going to support the counting of the $300 billion goal? And ideally, what percentage of the goal should be delivered as grant equivalent public finance from the developed countries to constitute them as leading? The second question, and I think maybe Mattias Goldmann could answer this. So going beyond the national governments, how do you think the corporate sector will respond to the way the discussions are evolving, both within and outside of Europe? And the third question, which popped up when you were discussing the possible exit of the US from the Paris Agreement, and maybe Katie and Priya could answer this one. So does this mean that the Paris Agreement is not important? Can we move forward without this agreement, which most climate decisions have been based on? So maybe for Mattias Frumerie to start with the first question. Thank you.
Thanks. I mean, from our side, just to recall that we increased our climate finance by almost 10% last year, and that's a commitment which the government has made to increase and make our climate finance more efficient. So that's, I mean, I would see that approach will be continuing also in the coming years. In terms of counting, I mean, we as all donors, we use the so-called Rio markers within the OECD. That's how we report on our climate finance. I don't see any changes coming up there. There might be sort of changes in the Rio markers themselves, in terms of how they're used and how, if to meet any kind of specific needs which we see need to be met. And in terms of the allocation between loans and grants, I think that's up to on the one hand, each and every one of the donors sort of to assess, how you structure your development finance more generally. But then, of course, also in the dialogue that we have with our donor, both with our donor partners, but also with our developing country partners, how do we make sure to deliver our climate finance to be as responsive as possible to the kinds of needs and priorities which our developing country partners put forward. And I think maybe that's my final point on this one, that there's so much conversation and discussion going on at the global level, in terms that there needs to be finance being allocated. I would say the key element for any kind of development, including climate finance flow, is that we have that kind of dialogue on the country level. What are the needs and priorities of our partner countries, and how can we as donors individually and as a group respond to those needs? Regardless of what kind of global targets we set ourselves. Because if there are no priorities and needs being set at the national level, as a result of a whole of government approach in developing countries, we will not be able to respond to those needs, because that's how the finance is being channeled at the country level. Thanks.
Super, thank you for that. And on the second question on the corporate sector, Mattias Goldmann, please.
Thank you so much. I believe that the first time around when we had Trump, the reason that the Paris Agreement was able to survive was largely thanks to the corporate sector, saying that we need the long-term stability and the clear trajectory that the Paris Agreement gives us. It tells us what is a stranded asset and what is going to be profitable in the long run, which is also why I'm very worried about the message from the last few COPs, that it's less and less about climate mitigation and more about very important topics as adaptation and loss and damage, but it also doesn't give the message to the corporate sector that we need, that it's still going to be about reducing emissions and creating favorable markets for emissions reductions. But having said that, I still believe that the business sector is there and can be there if we find better ways of getting them involved in adaptation. We're still struggling to find what is the business imperative to be part of climate adaptation. But we also need to understand that there's no such thing as the corporate sector or the business community. We've got large companies now that are clearly winning by moving further and faster into renewable and efficient society. But we also have the huge oil companies that are still dragging their feet and still trying to stop progress. And we saw that very clearly at COP29, that there was a larger business community than ever before on both sides, both on the renewable side, but also very clearly those trying to make business deals for fossil fuels. So it's important for us to not believe that there's a one business sector. There's at least two, and it's a struggle right now which side is going to win. And unfortunately, COP29 didn't help the good side of business.
Thank you for that assessment. And moving on to the third question on the relevance of the Paris Agreement. Kate, would you like to start?
Sure. I mean, I think that the Paris Agreement it's still relevant. We saw, I mean, this has been highlighted several times in this conversation, but there was fear when the US withdrew last time that it would fall apart, and it didn't. And I don't think it'll fall apart this time, even if we do see some sort of mini Trumps or whatever try to follow in the footsteps. I would also take the bet. I think the US is going to withdraw, if only because it's very easy for Trump to do so. All he needs to do is write an executive order, and he could do it on the first day if he wanted to. But I think that, to me, is not the threat to the credibility of the agreement. I think the threat to the credibility of the agreement is the fact that emissions are not slowing. And that is really the fundamental challenge. But I think it remains relevant with the US in it or out of it. And if anything, the US withdrawing just makes it a pariah state and undermines its own claim to world leadership at this point in time.
Thanks, great. And Priya, just to throw this out, others are saying that the Paris Agreement has set in motion this green transformation in many countries. And so the main task of the Paris Agreement now is to build resilience and make sure that adaptation happens around the world. Would you agree? Or do you think the Paris Agreement still has a role in mitigation side as well, even though we haven't seen much progress recently?
Yeah, I would agree that it has its relevance. For us, I think the focus at the moment for Fiji and maybe some of the other smaller Pacific Island countries as well, it's more on adaptation now. And so it has really been, Paris Agreement has really been the cornerstone of a lot of regional, national policies, plans, and strategies and frameworks that we are now utilizing for adaptation purposes, for migration purposes, for climate-induced relocation purposes. So I think it is still pretty much a very relevant document for us. And it has helped us to create some of the regional frameworks, like we launched at the COP29, we launched a Pacific Resilience Facility. It's like Pacific's homegrown solution to some of these climate finance problems that we are facing. So we have a dedicated facility for the Pacific Island nations. So we're I think targeting about USD 1.5 billion by January 2025, but it doesn't have, I mean, of course, it is based on the international best practices, but it's more targeted towards the issues and challenges faced by the Pacific region and how the different countries can now access these funds without all the bureaucracies and other challenges associated with accessing these international climate funds. So yeah, it's a very important framework for us in the Pacific.
All right, so I'll take a few other questions here from the chat. And one is regarding the Article 6. And the question is posed as, is the Article 6.2, will it look too much to Article 6.4 with a lot of extra requirements? Now someone took away the question here. Let me go back to it. With a lot of extra requirements to projects and give less sovereignty to trading countries like Sweden. And I assume maybe Mattias F is a good person for that question. And adding to the Article 6 also is a little bit of my own question. What is new here? Is there a risk that this just is a copy-paste of the old CDM structure in a sense? And that is maybe a question to Priya, if you have an answer to that. And another question is regarding the side events, that there seems to be a lot of more things happening on the side events. And is that a place where we should look for more solutions? So maybe that's an open question to everyone. So maybe I can start with the first question there on the Article 6 with the Frumerie.
Thanks. I'm not quite sure I really understood the question, because I mean, we set ourselves the framework in Article 6 in order to be able to deliver high outcome and high ambition mitigation outcomes, and to make it make Article 6 work as a tool to raise ambition, both in terms of when using it in these kind of bilateral agreements based on Article 6.2, but of course also based on the UN mechanism in Article 6.4. So I definitely see that, if we are to be using Article 6, it should definitely be providing an added value to what could have been done without using the mechanism itself. And it will definitely be something which has built on the lessons of the CDM mechanism. We see this as a mechanism which raises ambition and provides for that kind of what we call environmental integrity. Could I maybe just address also the side events, because I think that's really something which is showing what we discussed previously, all the solutions which are already out there. And I have been hoping for years basically that the kind of dynamism and the energy which we see in the side events, both sort of in the more sort of formal side events, but also in the various number of pavilions, how that could actually translate into the negotiation rooms. Because if we could get that, because then we would actually be able to reflect the kind of solutions which are already out there. All the work which is ongoing in so many countries by so many different types of actors, both business and the civil society, all various types of actors who are presenting the kind of results we're seeing already. And, for that to translate into negotiation rooms, we would be making so much more progress than we are doing presently.
Is there anyone else that would like to take on the question on the Article 6? Yeah, Mattias? No? Priya? Or Katherine?
I think
I don't
someone
think
raised their
anybody
hand.
I was just gonna say, I don't think anybody understands Article 6, even now that it's agreed. So I think the hesitancy reflects that, but maybe Priya does. Surprise us, Priya.
Katie, I don't understand that either. Maybe someone else.
All right. If we should leave this diluted and tough issue of Article 6, what about the side events? You mentioned a little bit about it, Priya, in your statement before, but what could that be a stepping block?
Yes, definitely. I also agree with Mattias. You see huge kind of discussions and deliberation among the different groups, civil society, private sector. Then you have so many researchers, and then that's when you get to know what's happening in the other part of the nation, and you have similar challenges, and maybe you'll find some solutions that is working for another group in another country, and that kind of discussions and the reflections from these side events. I think that we need to bridge that gap between what happens in the negotiation room and what are these different dialogues and deliberations going on at the side events. So there's it's at the side events that we really are able to build this kind of stakeholder relationship as well with the different groups that are involved. So I really enjoy the side events, and I think that is a great platform to explore, or maybe, as you mentioned earlier, it's something that may need to be really emphasized in future COPs, how we can, bridge that gap between negotiations and this type of dynamic discussions, deliberations, events, project information sharing, best practices sharing that happens in the side events. I think it's a really good platform to explore.
And Mattias, you want to say something about the side events?
I've been very excited going to the side events over the years. I just think it's a waste to have them at the COP, because firstly, the people that you want to reach are negotiating. Second, so they can't come. Secondly, there's going to be a bunch of side events at the same time. So the audience that you want to reach are going to be trying to get you to come to their event. And it makes more sense to have it this way, to meet without flying to a brutal dictatorship focusing on fossil fuels like we did now in Azerbaijan, and to make sure that you have it at a time where we can actually get the Swedish chief negotiator to be a part of the discussion, and other important policymakers as well, which you can't at the side events. But I would love to mention a thing sort of in between the formal negotiations and the side events where everything is possible but nothing really happens. And that's the carbon clubs, where you find a coalition of the willing between businesses and between countries, and you don't have to wait for the country that wants the least, which is going to block progress, which we've seen now over so many COPs. And you have these agreements on short-lived climate gases, or on aviation, or on agriculture, or whatever. Those carbon clubs are where we see important progress, and we can actually hold accountable the countries and the companies signing up in a way that, of course, you can't with a regular side event.
Thanks. So I give Erik the last word here on.
Yeah, it's also on the side events very shortly. I agree with what Mattias just said. It was very difficult to follow any of these, as I was also in the negotiations all the time. But still, they are of course interesting. But one should also be very aware that there are side events and also in the national pavilions, etc., that are kind of part of greenwashing events as well. So you should be really take care about that. And there were also in not at the COP meeting, I don't know that, but in the Bonn meeting in the summer, there were events on solar radiation management and things like that. And it's sometimes very scary pictures that are painted there, and that is not really close to the core of what the whole thing should be about. And so you need to be aware of that as well.
Okay, thank you so much. And I leave the word to someone else here in the...
Me, perhaps?
Yeah, good.
Thank you, Madeleine. Also, I didn't present you, but you're director of the Center for Climate Science Policy Research and at the Linköping University. Okay, so it's about closing time. I could just mention that I think it was 14 years ago, Mattias Järpe and I published a paper where we showed survey data that about a third of those who attended side events were either negotiators or government representatives. But that was a long time ago, so maybe things are changing. Okay, on a side note, my last thing that I want to do is to sincerely thank you all panelists. This has been fantastic. You certainly, for sure, has deepened my understanding, not only what happened in Baku, but also on how we move forward towards COP30 in Berlin, in Brazil, and onwards. I think your insights has been super valuable. So thank you so much. I would also like to thank Maria Cole, Ylva Rylander, and Olesia Polishok, and the communications team at SCI, who is fantastic, that excels time and time over again. So thank you so much on behalf of SCI and the Center for Climate and Policy Research at Linköping University and the Mistra Geopolitics program. All of you, a deep thank you. I have tons of questions left, and I know that there is also so many from the audience. So you have to join Mattias, Katie, and me for the Paris Agreement Remain or Withdrawal betting lunch, where the coffee will be on Mattias and the lunch will be on the rest of us. Okay? Yes. Okay. Thank you so much.